My granddaughter's voice was trembling when she said it. "Grandpa, Mom and Dad are going to take your money." It wasn't the sort of thing a 10-year-old invents on a rainy Sunday afternoon. The way she glanced over her shoulder before speaking, the way her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, it was the body language of someone repeating something they weren't supposed to know. I didn't ask her to explain right away. I didn't want to scare her into silence. I just nodded and told her she could tell me whenever she felt ready. That night I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt different, like the walls had ears. My son, Daniel, and his wife, Claire, had been staying here temporarily after some financial trouble. At least that's what they told me. I'd welcomed them without question. It wasn't the first time family needed help, and I'd never been the type to turn my back. But lately things had changed. Claire had started hovering in my study, asking about the old safe in the corner. Daniel was more interested in my future plans than in any real conversation. And the little notebook where I tracked my bank withdrawals? Twice now, I'd found it in a different drawer than where I'd left it. Still, hearing it from my granddaughter, that was different. She didn't have an agenda. She wasn't playing a game. The next morning, over breakfast, I tried to keep my voice casual. "So, Emma," I said, "what made you say what you said yesterday?" She looked down at her cereal. "I heard Mom talking to Dad when they thought I was asleep," she said. "Once we get him to sign, we can use the money to get our own place." "Sign what?" I asked. Emma shrugged. "I don't know, but Dad said it has to look like your idea." I kept stirring my coffee, even though it had already gone cold. That was the first real piece of the puzzle. They wanted my signature on something, a transfer, a withdrawal, maybe even the title to the apartment. And they didn't want me to suspect it was their plan. The rest of the day, I watched them more closely. Claire was in and out of the guest room, their temporary room, making phone calls with the door shut. Daniel spent an hour at my desk, claiming he was checking emails because his laptop was acting up. When I came into the room, he jumped like I'd caught him doing something. It wasn't paranoia. It was observation. I made a decision that afternoon. I wouldn't confront them. Not yet. Confrontation gives the other person control. They can deny, twist, or prepare for your next move. I needed them unprepared. Instead, I called my old friend Mark. We'd served together in the Army decades ago, but these days he worked in private security. He owed me more than one favor. "Mark," I said, "I need two things. A small camera I can hide in my study, and a way to copy documents without leaving a trace." There was a pause. "This about Daniel?" "Let's just say I want to know exactly who's in my house," I replied. By that evening, I had what I needed. Emma stayed in her room after dinner, reading. Daniel and Claire went out for groceries and were gone for almost 2 hours. When they came back, Claire was holding a folder under her arm. She didn't put it down until she went into their room and closed the door. At 2 a.m., when the apartment was silent, I slipped out of bed and into the guest room. They hadn't locked it. The folder was on the nightstand. Inside were real estate listings, budget spreadsheets, and, at the very bottom, a draft of a joint investment agreement. It had my name printed at the top. No signature yet. I stood there for a long time, the weight of the paper heavier than it should have been. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. If this was the game they wanted to play, I could play it better. Emma had given me the first warning. The next move was mine. The next morning I made sure to act normal. That's the first rule. You don't tip your hand until you're ready to close the trap. Claire was in a bright mood, humming while she made coffee. Daniel was unusually talkative, asking if I'd considered consolidating some of my accounts to make things simpler. I just smiled and told him I'd think about it. Inside, I was making lists. By mid-afternoon, Mark came by. He pretended to be dropping off a borrowed book, but the real delivery was in his jacket pocket. 2 small pinhole cameras and a portable scanner. I set the cameras up that night, one in my study aimed at the desk, the other in the hallway near the safe. The scanner went in my own bedroom, in the drawer with my important papers. Over the next 4 days, the cameras caught plenty. Claire rifling through my desk drawers while Daniel distracted me in the kitchen. Daniel pulling out my old insurance folder, flipping through it, then putting it back in a slightly different position. Claire kneeling in front of the safe, running her hand over the combination dial as if she could guess it by touch. On the 5th day, the opportunity I'd been waiting for came. I was in the living room reading when Daniel came in holding a new folder. "Dad, I've been thinking. We should set up a joint investment account. That way, if something happens to you, things won't be complicated for me and Claire. Just one signature and it's done." I took the folder, flipped through it slowly. It was exactly what Emma had overheard, an agreement that would give them direct access to my savings. "You know," I said, "I should get my reading glasses. My eyes aren't what they used to be." I stood, folder in hand, and went to my study. While they waited in the kitchen, I used the scanner to copy every page. Then I returned, sat down, and smiled. "Let me think it over tonight. I'll give you an answer tomorrow." They agreed too easily, which told me they thought they'd already won. That night I called Mark again. "I have their document," I said. "I want to make a new version." "You want a fake?" "Not fake," I corrected. "Just adjusted." By the next evening I had it, a version of their agreement that looked identical except for one hidden clause buried in legal jargon. The clause stated that the account, once opened, would require my sole authorization for any withdrawals, and would automatically revert entirely to my control in the event of any evidence of coercion, manipulation, or misrepresentation. In other words, they could sign it thinking they were taking my money, but in reality they'd be signing an admission that would make it impossible for them to touch a cent. The following day, I acted distracted, almost hesitant, like I'd been wrestling with the decision. Daniel took the bait, urging me to just get it over with. Claire chimed in, telling me how much easier it would make things. I handed them the agreement, my version, and watched them skim the first page, then sign without reading the rest. They left the room smiling, believing they'd just secured their future. What they didn't know was that they'd just secured my protection. Later that night, Emma knocked softly on my bedroom door. "Grandpa, did you sign the paper they wanted?" she asked, eyes wide. "Yes," I said, "but it's not what they think it is." She tilted her head. "Does that mean they can't take your money?" "That's exactly what it means." For the first time in weeks, I saw her smile without worry. I didn't tell her the rest. Not yet. That I had hours of video showing their attempts to access my safe. That I had documented every suspicious move they'd made since moving in. That I had the original document they'd brought me, proof of their intent. Because this wasn't just about keeping my money. It was about making sure they could never try something like this again. And for that, I still had one more move to make. The trap was set, but I knew better than to spring it too soon. When people think they've already won, they grow careless, and careless people leave evidence. Over the next week, I kept my distance. I let Daniel and Claire feel comfortable, almost overconfident. They started talking more openly, whispering less. I caught bits of conversation in the kitchen. "Once we get the funds transferred, I already found a realtor." They didn't even notice the tiny camera above the bookshelf recording every word. Mark dropped by again on Thursday, this time under the pretense of returning tools I'd supposedly lent him. In reality, he came to collect the video footage and back it up somewhere safe. If Daniel or Claire decided to snoop through my things, they wouldn't find anything. That Friday, they made their move. I was in my chair reading when Daniel came in with an exaggerated smile. "Dad, we talked to the bank this morning. Everything's set up. We just need you to come in Monday to finalize the account." Claire was leaning against the doorway, her arms folded like she was watching the finish line of a race. I nodded slowly. "All right, Monday." Inside, I felt nothing but stillness. Because Monday wasn't going to be the end for me. It was going to be the end for them. Over the weekend, I prepared. I printed out the original document they'd brought me, the one without my changes. I labeled it clearly in a folder marked Evidence. I also printed copies of the security footage still frames. Claire opening drawers in my study, Daniel at my safe, both of them reviewing real estate listings. Emma stayed with a friend that weekend. I told her it was just so she could have some fun. But the truth was I didn't want her anywhere near what was about to happen. Monday morning, they were dressed sharp. Claire in a blazer she usually saved for important occasions. Daniel wearing the tie he'd worn to my wife's funeral. They must have thought the day deserved some kind of ceremony. The three of us walked into the bank together. My banker, Mr. Lawson, had been briefed. I'd known him for 20 years, long enough to trust that he'd play along without a single slip. Daniel slid the agreement, my altered version, across the desk. I signed it with a steady hand. They signed it too, still without reading. When it was done, Mr. Lawson excused himself to process the paperwork. I knew he was just making copies for me and for the secure file we'd set aside. As we left, Claire leaned in close. Feels good to have things sorted, doesn't it? I looked at her and smiled. Not warmly, not with anger, just with the calm that comes from knowing you've already won. Back at the apartment, I told them I needed to rest for a bit and retreated to my room. Once the door was closed, I called Mark. It's done, I said. Good, he replied. Now what? Now, I said. We let them make the next move. The faster they try to touch the money, the faster they'll realize they've walked into a wall. That wall was reinforced with more than just the clause in the agreement. The moment they made a withdrawal attempt, the bank would flag the account, freeze it, and send me an alert. At the same time, my lawyer would receive all the evidence, signed originals, security footage, timelines. It wasn't just about stopping them. It was about ending their ability to even think about trying something like this again. By Wednesday, I had my answer. Daniel came home angry, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Claire followed, her jaw clenched, a folded letter in her hand. What the hell is this? Daniel demanded, tossing the letter onto the coffee table. It was from the bank. A formal notice that any withdrawal from the account required my authorization alone. I looked at it, then back at them. Looks like you should have read the fine print. Claire's face went pale. Daniel's fists clenched. And I sat there, steady, silent, letting the truth settle like dust after a storm. They knew it was over. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Daniel didn't speak to me for 2 days after the bank letter. Claire tried, but her attempts were half-hearted. A polite good morning here, a forced smile there. It was the kind of behavior you see when someone is already thinking about their exit strategy. I kept to my routines. Coffee at 7. Walk to the corner store. Reading in the afternoon. It wasn't just habit. It was a way to remind them that I was unshaken. On the third evening, they finally broke. Claire came into the living room while Daniel stood in the doorway, arms crossed. She placed herself carefully in front of me, hands clasped like she was delivering bad news at a funeral. We were just trying to help, she said softly. I looked up from my book. By taking my money? Her lips tightened, but she didn't flinch. By making sure it didn't get wasted. Daniel cut in. You don't even spend it, Dad. You're sitting on it while we're struggling. We thought. You thought wrong, I said, my voice flat. The silence that followed was heavy. They weren't going to apologize, not really. This wasn't about regret. It was about being caught. I think it's time you both started looking for another place, I said. Claire's eyes widened. You're kicking us out? I'm giving you 2 weeks, I replied. After that, the locks change. Daniel's jaw clenched. We have nowhere to go. That's not my problem, I said, standing. You made your choices. Now you live with them. They didn't argue after that. They just left the room, their footsteps quick and sharp down the hall. I waited until I heard their door close before pulling out my phone. Mark answered on the first ring. That the sound of a win? Almost, I said. 2 weeks and they're out. But I want to make sure they leave without taking anything else. We set up a final safeguard, a discreet inventory of the apartment, noting every valuable item, every important document. Anything portable enough to disappear was either locked in the safe or stored off-site. I wasn't going to give them one last chance to hurt me. The first week of their countdown passed quietly, almost eerily so. They avoided me, stayed in their room, and ate most of their meals elsewhere. But I noticed Claire slipping out alone more often, and Daniel spending late nights on the phone in hushed tones. I knew the signs. They weren't just planning where to go. They were planning one last move. Sure enough, on the 12th day, while they thought I was out on my morning walk, Daniel tried the safe. I watched it happen from my phone, the camera feed clear as daylight. He failed, of course. I'd changed the combination. That afternoon, I printed the footage and slid it under their door. No note, no confrontation, just the truth delivered cold. By the next morning, they were packing. Emma came over that evening. She looked around the half-empty guest room and asked, "Are they leaving?" "Yes," I said. "Soon." She hesitated. "Will I still get to see them?" I didn't answer right away. "That's up to them," I finally said. "But I won't let them hurt you or me again." She nodded, small but certain. The night before their deadline, Daniel stood in the hallway, suitcase in hand. Claire was already downstairs, waiting by the car. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even look at me, and that was fine, because the real goodbye had happened weeks ago, the moment they chose greed over blood. The apartment was quieter than it had been in months. No whispered phone calls. No sudden silences when I walked into a room. No one hovering near my study like a shadow. But quiet doesn't mean finished. I knew Daniel and Claire. Prideful, stubborn. Convinced that they were owed something. People like that don't just walk away. They circle back, looking for a crack to squeeze through. That's why I spent the first week after they left making calls. First to my lawyer, Mr. Jensen. I gave him the signed agreement they thought would give them my money, along with the original draft they'd brought me, the video evidence, and a detailed timeline of every suspicious act they'd committed. "This isn't just insurance," I told him. "It's a wall they can't climb." Then to my banker, Mr. Lawson, to ensure every account had extra verification layers. Not just passwords, but in-person ID requirements, my ID. No proxy, no exceptions. Finally, to Mark. "I want you to keep an eye on them for a while," I said. Not invasive, just aware. He understood. "You want to know if they start circling again." Exactly. While those safeguards went into place, I turned my attention to the one thing I hadn't yet addressed. Emma. She had been caught in the middle of this without asking for it. She needed to know the truth, but not in a way that would poison her against her parents forever. So one Saturday afternoon, I took her out for ice cream. She listened quietly as I explained that sometimes people make bad choices because they think it's the only way to get what they want. That those choices can hurt the people they're supposed to care for. "Like mom and dad?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, but what matters is that you're safe and that I'm safe. That's what's important now." She thought about it for a while before saying, "I'm glad I told you." "So am I," I said. That night, Mark called. "You're going to like this," he said. "Guess who just tried to apply for a loan using your address as collateral?" I didn't have to guess. "Send me the paperwork," I told him. It was sloppy. They'd listed my apartment as an inherited property, already under their control. A simple call to the bank shut it down instantly, but it told me something important. They weren't finished trying, so I decided to finish it for them. The next morning, I met with Mr. Jensen again. We drafted a cease and desist letter, backed by the evidence I'd been collecting since Emma's warning. It wasn't just a polite request, it was a legal hammer. Any further attempt to access my property, accounts, or identity would result in criminal charges. We sent it by certified mail. 2 days later, I got the confirmation receipt. 3 days after that, Mark reported that Daniel and Claire had moved out of their apartment in the next town over. No forwarding address. No contact. For the first time in months, I believed they might actually be gone. But I didn't take down the cameras. I didn't move the safe. I didn't loosen the locks. Because peace isn't something you assume. It's something you guard. That Friday, Emma came over after school and found me reading by the window. "They're gone, aren't they?" she asked. "For now," I said. "And maybe for good." She smiled, small but genuine, and settled into the chair across from me with her homework. The quiet felt different this time. Not tense. not waiting for the next move. Felt earned. And I intended to keep it that way. The thing about people like Daniel and Claire is that they're allergic to consequences, but they remember fear. If you can make the risk outweigh the reward, they won't touch the fire again. The cease and desist letter was just the first strike. I spent the next week building the second. Mr. Jensen helped me prepare a notarized statement detailing their attempt to defraud me, complete with signed agreements, timestamped security footage, and Emma's account of what she overheard. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet, but it was a case file ready to be filed in court at a moment's notice. We didn't serve it to them. We made sure they knew it existed. Mark found out they were staying with one of Claire's cousins in a cramped two-bedroom apartment across town. One evening, he delivered a sealed envelope to their temporary address. Inside was a single copy of the statement, with a note in my handwriting. "For your records, in case you forget what I can prove." They didn't reply. But 2 days later, Mark said he'd seen Daniel at a bus station with a duffel bag, boarding a coach headed 3 states over. Claire didn't follow right away, but by the end of the week, she was gone too. That solved the physical problem. The psychological one lingered. Emma asked about them less and less, but I could see the quiet questions in her eyes when she visited. Was it safe now? Would they come back? I made her a promise one Saturday afternoon while we were walking in the park. "No one is going to take what's mine," I said, "and no one is going to take me away from you, ever." She didn't say anything, but she slipped her small hand into mine and squeezed. That was enough. I kept the cameras running, not because I expected them to return, but because vigilance is a habit you don't drop. My account stayed locked down. My will was updated, ironclad, airtight, with Jensen listed as executor. If Daniel and Claire ever tried to circle back, they'd find not just a wall, but a fortress. Weeks passed. The apartment felt alive again, not like a place under siege. Emma came by more often, bringing school projects to show me, sometimes even sleeping over on weekends. We baked cookies, watched old movies, even started a small vegetable garden on the balcony. I didn't talk about Daniel and Claire anymore. I let them fade into the background like bad weather that had passed. But one evening, while I was watering the tomatoes, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You'll regret what you did." No name, no context. But I didn't need either. I didn't reply. I didn't even save the number. Instead, I forwarded it to Mark, who traced it within hours. It was sent from a prepaid phone, purchased in the same city Daniel had fled to. I told Mark to file the text away with the rest of the evidence. If they wanted to keep sending me reminders of who they really were, I'd let them. Every message, every call, every slip-up added another brick to the wall I'd built between us. And one day, if they pushed too far, I'd have enough bricks to bury them completely. Until then, I'd keep living. On my terms. 2 months passed without a word from Daniel or Claire. It was almost enough to make me think they'd finally learned their lesson. Almost. Then Mark called one Tuesday morning. His voice had that tight, clipped tone I recognized from our army days, the tone he used when he was reporting something important. "They're back in the state," he said. "Not here, but close. And you're not going to like why." He explained that Claire had been seen at a local law office, asking questions about contesting property titles. Daniel wasn't with her, but it didn't take much to connect the dots. If they couldn't steal from me directly, they were going to try to find a legal loophole. I didn't waste time being angry. Anger clouds judgment. Instead, I called Jensen. "They're sniffing around again," I told him. "Time to use the file." We met that afternoon. Jensen spread the evidence across his desk like a general reviewing battle plans. The altered agreement, the original document, the security footage, the text message, the attempted loan application. Piece by piece, it painted a picture of intent so clear even a first-year law student could argue it. "This isn't just civil," Jensen said, tapping the stack. "We could make this criminal. Fraud, attempted theft, coercion." I nodded. "Do it. But I don't want them arrested on the spot. I want them to see it coming. I want them to know I'm holding the sword over their heads." The next step was surgical. Jensen sent a formal letter to Claire's inquiry attorney, outlining our evidence and making it clear that any further attempt to touch my assets would result in immediate criminal charges. The letter was deliberately copied to Daniel as well. 2 days later, I got a call. It was Daniel. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice low and bitter. "Yes," I said calmly. "I did. You're really going to put your own son in jail? You already put yourself there. I'm just holding the door open." There was a long pause, then the line went dead. I didn't hear from him again, but Mark reported seeing them leave town a week later, traveling separately. Claire headed west, Daniel east. It didn't matter. The file stayed active. The moment either of them tried something, the charges would go through. I told Emma nothing about this round. She didn't need more shadows hanging over her. All she needed to know was that I was here, that the walls were high and that nothing and no one was getting through. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that Daniel's call had been more than just a reaction. It had felt like a warning, not of something they would do to me directly, but of a mess they might leave behind. And sure enough, a mess came. But it didn't come to my door. Came to Emma's. It was a Saturday morning when Emma showed up at my door, clutching her school backpack like it was a shield. Her eyes were red, her voice small. "Grandpa." There were 2 men outside our apartment. They asked me if I knew where Mom was. I set my coffee down. "What did you tell them?" I said no. Then I ran. I didn't press her for details right away. I just led her inside, locked the door, and called her mother's number. Claire's old number. Disconnected. I tried Daniel's. Straight to voicemail. Mark was my next call. "Find out who those men are. Today." By mid-afternoon, he had an answer. They weren't police. They weren't even debt collectors in the formal sense. They were muscle, hired to remind Claire about some money she apparently owed. It didn't take much to guess where that money came from. "Are they a danger to Emma?" I asked. "Not if she's with you," Mark said. "But they'll keep sniffing around if they think she can lead them to Claire." That was enough for me. I called Jensen. "File it," I said. "You're sure?" "Yes. Every charge, every count. Fraud, attempted theft, harassment, and make sure it sticks to both of them." The next 48 hours were a blur of paperwork and coordination. Jensen moved fast, faster than I'd ever seen him work, and by Monday morning the warrants were signed. Daniel was picked up first, at a bus terminal in another county. Claire went down a day later, caught trying to cross into another state. I didn't go to the hearings. I didn't need to see them in handcuffs to know the fight was over. But I did make sure the court understood the full scope of what they'd done. Not just to me, but to Emma. The judge issued a no-contact order as part of their bail conditions. They weren't allowed within 500 feet of me or Emma. When I told her, she didn't say anything right away. She just leaned against me, silent but steady. That night, after she'd fallen asleep on the couch, I sat in my chair and thought about everything that had happened. This hadn't been about money for a long time. It had been about trust, how easily it can be broken, and how hard it is to rebuild. Daniel and Claire had taken their shot. They'd underestimated me, and now they were gone. Not just from my home, but from my life. Emma didn't need to know every detail. She didn't need to carry that weight. All she needed to know was that her grandfather would always keep her safe. And that's exactly what I intended to do. When the court dates were finally set, I made a choice. I wasn't going to testify in person. Jensen would handle everything on my behalf. Not because I feared facing Daniel or Claire, but because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me in that setting. They'd already taken too much space in my life. I wouldn't give them one more inch. Instead, I wrote a statement, 14 pages, single-spaced, laying out the entire timeline. From Emma's trembling warning that first night, to the moment the police put them in cuffs. I detailed every attempt they'd made, every piece of evidence I'd gathered, every lie they'd told. And I didn't write it for the judge. I wrote it for the record, so that if Daniel or Claire ever tried to spin a different version of the story, the truth would already be etched in black and white. Jensen called me the day after the hearing. "It's done. The DA's office is moving forward with charges on both. You'll get official notice in the mail." What about the civil side? I asked. That's locked in too. They're barred from contesting your property or assets for 10 years. Minimum. And the no-contact order stands. I thanked him, but I didn't celebrate. Victories like this aren't parades. They're quiet, measured. They settle into the background like a locked door you don't have to check twice. Emma came over that weekend, and for the first time in months, she didn't ask about her parents. Instead, she asked if we could start fixing up the spare room, the one Daniel and Claire had occupied. Why? I asked. So it can be mine when I visit. We spent the next 2 days emptying it completely. Everything they'd left behind went into boxes, not to store, but to dispose of. I didn't want their shadow lingering here. Emma helped me paint the walls a warm, pale yellow. We put up shelves for her books, a small desk for her homework, and a bright quilt on the bed. By the time we were finished, it didn't feel like the same room. Felt like hers. That night, over dinner, she said quietly, "It's nicer now." "Yes," I said. "It is." But even as I was building something new, I wasn't naive enough to think the story was over. People like Daniel and Claire don't just disappear. They retreat, they lick their wounds, and sometimes years later they resurface. That's why I kept the cameras running. That's why the safe stayed locked. That's why the file Jensen had built, thicker now with court orders and arrest records, sat in my locked desk drawer. Not because I expected them back tomorrow, but because I knew that preparation was the difference between sleeping well and sleeping with one eye open. One evening, a month after the arrests, Mark came by. We sat on the balcony, drinking coffee as the city lights blinked on. "You did good," he said. "I didn't do it for good," I replied. "I did it for quiet." "Same thing," he shrugged. Maybe he was right, because as Emma slept in her new room, and the only sound in the apartment was the steady hum of the refrigerator, I realized something. I wasn't waiting for the next move anymore. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't playing defense. I'd built my fortress, and from here on out, anyone who tried to breach it would find themselves standing in the same cold shadow Daniel and Claire now lived in. Far from me, far from Emma, where they belonged. The official letters arrived on a Tuesday morning. Heavy envelopes, the kind you don't mistake for junk mail. One from the court, confirming the finalization of the no-contact order. The other from Jensen's office, a neat summary of the civil settlement. I read them slowly, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to feel each line settle into place. Every paragraph was another lock sliding shut. Every signature was another nail in the coffin of what Daniel and Claire had tried to take from me. There was no satisfaction in the words. Satisfaction implies joy, and there was nothing joyful about any of this. What I felt was quieter, heavier, a kind of stillness that only comes when the last piece of a long, ugly puzzle clicks into place. I filed the letters away in the desk drawer with the rest of the evidence. Then I locked it, not because I needed to hide it, but because it was finished. That afternoon, Emma came over with a plate of cookies she'd baked herself. She wandered into her new room without asking, humming as she unpacked a few books and set them on the shelf. Watching her, I realized that this was what all of it had been for. Not the money, not the property. Safety. She still didn't know the full extent of what her parents had done. Maybe one day she'd be old enough to understand, maybe not. But I'd decided long ago that her childhood wouldn't be the battlefield for my war with them. Over dinner, she told me about her school project, how she'd been chosen to present it in front of the class. She spoke without fear, without the weight I'd seen in her eyes months ago. And for the first time, I felt like I'd given her something worth more than any inheritance. Peace. When I walked her to the door later that evening, she hugged me tight. "See you next weekend, Grandpa." I stood there after she left, listening to her footsteps fade down the hall. The apartment was quiet again. Not the suffocating quiet of suspicion, but the kind that feels earned. Daniel and Claire were still out there somewhere, their lives shrinking in the shadow of the choices they'd made. I didn't need to chase them. The law was now a wall between us, and the life I'd rebuilt was on my side of it. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat in my chair by the window, and watched the city lights blink in the distance. They'd tried to take everything from me with a single signature. Instead, they'd signed away any place they had in my life. And that, I knew, was a contract that would never be broken.